Anna gritted her teeth and clenched her fists for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. She was tempted to reach across the table to smack Dee, her work rival, just to wipe that smug smile off her face. Dee couldn't even be civil enough to hide her excitement at Anna's big goof that morning at the client's presentation. Now she was doing it again at the in-house meeting where her boss was scolding her for tanking the presentation and for costing the company money. Everyone should work on their assigned tasks for what's coming up and ensure that they have the deliverables ready before the next team meeting. Donald's gruff voice brought Anna back to the room and to what was happening around her. Donald was the leader of the sales team for the 3 years that Anna had worked at Savvy Chic, the boutique fashion company Anna worked for. Savvy Chic catered to the fashion needs of celebrities in Manhattan. They ensured that their clients wore what no one else was wearing at the moment. They paraded themselves as the trendsetters of New York City. Anna's big mistake that morning had involved curating a couple of looks for a supermodel client who unfortunately happened to have seen many of the eyes Anna suggested pulled off by other people. They had lost their shit and tweeted about it 10 minutes later. Things quickly escalated soon later, with many people bashing the online company ad, calling them essential, and being about a lot of hype. The last thing a company like Savvy Chic wanted to be called was necessary. Anna was almost sure someone had sabotaged her. This particular pitch had been fundamental to Anna, not just because it meant that she could use it as leverage to ask for a promotion, but also because it was her chance to put Dee in her place. Anna was cheerful. Someone had tampered with her slides, and she knew who it could have been. Anna remembered Dee being overly friendly in the days leading to the presentation, dropping by Anna's desk often to ask how her presentation was going. Although Anna had regarded Dee cautiously, Dee had still found a way to access her computer. Anna was not too surprised about this. Dee was a computer whiz who had studied software development but segued into fashion because that was her passion. After the team meeting, Donald asked Anna to stay back so he could talk to her personally. Anna had expected him to be nasty and was taken aback when Donald spent the next 2 minutes reassuring her. Donald's kindness to her that morning touched a vulnerable part of her, and she soon found herself opening up to him about her problems and her suspicions about being sabotaged by Dee. "I have just been so frustrated, Donald. Charles is cheating on me. He keeps getting all these texts and emails and hiding them from me. It's as though I'm not good enough for him," she cried into his shoulder. "Come on, Anna, you're good enough for anyone. You deserve better than a cheater who has no respect for you or your feelings." Anna decided to go home to confront her unfaithful husband about his infidelity. Charles, her husband, had been waiting for her when she arrived home. He had laid out the table for dinner, and the whole place smelled good. This gesture had caught her off guard, but the bombshell came much later. After a very sumptuous dinner, followed by rounds of passionate lovemaking, exploring every bit of her, taking advantage of the fact that he knew her body so well, Charles dropped a bombshell. "I want a divorce." "What?" "I want a divorce, Anna. I'm not happy." "What do you mean you're not happy?" "Don't you dare pretend you don't know what this is about, you cheating bitch. You've been sleeping with Donald for months." "You disgust me," Charles screamed as he stormed out of the room. Anna was shocked. How dare Charles falsely accuse her of the very thing he was doing and try to make her the wrong person? How dare he make love to her only to ask her for a divorce? 4 months later, Anna couldn't believe the state of her life. Charles had left home and still insists he wants a divorce. At work, Anna was having a tough time. To reduce the population of people at the office, the company had decided to allow some members of its staff to transition to remote work. Anna had not wanted to work remotely because she knew she didn't want to miss out on all the juicy stuff, but she had no choice. Anna was behind on a lot of her projects because someone on the team had taken the time to always miscommunicate things with her. So far, she's gotten 2 queries and missed 2 client presentations because someone forgot to copy the emails announcing the presentations to her. Anna felt overwhelmed by it all. She felt lonely and was tempted to call her mother, but thought better. Anna had not spoken to both her parents since she left home 5 years before and moved to the city and got married. How could her conservative mother, who had not approved of her marriage to a non-Catholic, react to the news that her daughter was now separated and was failing at the job she had left her family for. As Anna stepped into the towering glass building housing Savvy Chic, she was struck by how empty and how quiet everywhere seemed. Where was everybody? Today was the big presentation. She walked straight to the conference room, where the display for the day was supposed to take place, to rehearse again before other people arrived. She made sure to come an hour earlier. What Anna saw as she stepped into the room shocked her out of her senses. The entire team at Savvy Chic, along with their most important client, were deep into a presentation led by Dee. Anna was shocked. She was sure she had read the mail correctly, and it had said noon. How could they have started without her? Anna slipped in quietly, took a seat in the remotest part of the room, and watched as Dee went through slide after slide of fashion items and spoke eloquently, trying to sell the idea of infusing African prints into his tux to their Afghanian client. Anna had to admit that Dee was very good at her job. The meeting ended precisely 12 minutes after Anna's arrival. After the client left, everyone else walked up to Dee to congratulate her on killing the presentation. Anna felt humiliated and was torn between walking up to Dee or just slipping out as quietly as she had slipped in. "Nice of you to join us, Anna. Bye, office." Katharina's voice interrupted her mental battle. Katharina was the founder and CEO of Savvy Chic, who rarely interacted with the employees, even though it was a small company. 1 hour later, Anna was leaving the office building as a former employee. Katharina had asked to see Anna so that she could fire her. She had gone on and on for minutes about how Anna had stopped putting in effort and turned in low-quality work of late. Katharina yelled about how she had chosen to overlook all of that until she realized Anna was a criminal who had been stealing from the company. Katharina informed her that she was about to be let go and the police were waiting for her downstairs to take her in for questioning. Anna tried to defend herself, but it was of no use. Anna spent the night in jail till Donald came to bail her out. She couldn't bring herself to call Charles. They left the station and went straight to a bar. After about 3 hours, Anna was hammered. She had rambled on for 2 hours about her life. It was surprising that Donald just sat there listening to her go on about her parents not giving her any liberties as a teenager and a young adult and how she desperately wanted to go back home and reconcile with her family. Still, she didn't want to return home as the rebellious daughter who had failed at rebelling. She wanted to be able to say no when her parents asked that she join the family business. But there was no way to convince her parents that she could take care of herself when she didn't have anything much going on for herself. She was about to pass out when she felt strong arms lift her off the stool. Anna opened her eyes, taking in her surroundings. It wasn't long before she realized where she was. She had been there before when Donald celebrated his 40th birthday. What was she doing in Donald's house? Anna tried to recall what had brought her there, but that made her head hurt, so she stopped and waited. In what felt like hours later, Donald came in. Anna was relieved to see him. Finally, she could get an explanation, but the Donald she saw was different, menacing. He stood over her for what seemed like an eternity before finally speaking. He sounded like he was heartbroken. "I'm sorry for doing this to you, Anna, but I'm in a fix. I need money. The money you can help me get." "But I don't have any money." "Well, you might not have the money I need, but you can help me get it. You said many things while we were together, and that got me thinking." "Well, what?" "You have rich parents, Anna. They will be more than willing to pay for your life." Anna had left her hometown to escape the almost imperial life she had been born into and to make a way for herself without any input from her parents. Now they were going to have to pay for her life. She watched as Donald made the call demanding $5 million from her parents so she didn't get killed. Anna didn't want to believe that Donald could kill her, but who would have thought Donald, the gentle, kind boss everybody turned to, could kidnap someone, let alone someone who considered him a friend? After about 48 hours in Donald's custody, and they didn't hear from her parents, Anna knew she was in deep shit. Could her parents possibly turn their backs on her at this point? Donald walked around the room looking angry and dangerous. It was then that Anna heard the commotion outside. Police officers surrounded the building, and a helicopter circled the sky above them. Anna was being rescued. Donald dragged her out of the building, pointing a gun Anna never knew he had at her skull. Anna had never felt so much fear in her life. Fear so raw she could almost taste it. And then she heard it, Donald's body falling to the ground. Anna didn't see where the shot had come from, but she had never been able to appreciate guns the way she did at that moment. She was free. Anna ran out of the building, and there was Charles, her parents, and Katharina waiting to receive her. Charles pulled her into his embrace, repeatedly apologizing for hurting her. "I'm so sorry, Anna. I'm so sorry I let her get into my head. She kept feeding me all these lies." Anna knew just what she was talking about. Months ago, she had stumbled upon the mails that Dee had sent to Charles about a made-up affair that she was having with Donald. It all sounded so convincing, and with pictures of Anna and Donald taken at incriminating angles, Anna couldn't blame Charles for not believing her, although she wished that Charles had trusted her much more. Katharina was also there, apologizing for not believing her, not giving her the benefit of the doubt, and asking her to return to the company. Anna didn't know how to feel. She had lost her job, the love of her life, and almost lost her life. And now she had it all back.
On October 25th, Allison, a young artist's life, divided into before and after. She was informed that her parents had died in a car accident. There was a terrible accident on the road. Heavy rain and poor visibility on the road caused it. Fear, uncertainty, and sadness overwhelmed the girl. She was left alone in a big and unfair world. There were no more people she loved more than herself. She was angry, crying, and suffering. She didn't leave the house for weeks. As a child, Allison had a friend named Ron. From an early age, they played with each other and spent much time together. Their families communicated well. Ron and Allison's parents shared a profitable business. They ran a construction company. For a small town, it was a perfect business. Mothers of children were housewives. Their main interest was to attend social events. Their names were known in local circles. They were published in local newspapers, and people watched the lives of each family member. Their popularity grew every year. Their income increased. The fathers dreamed of the future of Ron and Allison and their continuation of the family business. Finally, the children grew up. Ron was immediately taken to the holding of his father. Allison graduated from the Academy of Art. She dreamed of becoming an architect since childhood. Management didn't interest Allison. Ron showed interest in the girl. He courted her, asked her out, and gave flowers and expensive gifts. But Allison didn't reciprocate with Ron. She considered him a good friend, but no more. Her heart was empty and forbidden to him, no matter how hard Ron tried. "What can I do for you?" Ron asked once Allison nervously. "You can't make someone feel something that isn't there and never will be." Allison said it very coldly, without looking him in the eye. She couldn't bring herself to love him. Allison was different, not like her family. Social events and luxurious life were of no interest to the girl. She helped children's homes, attended art exhibitions, and studied. Ron looked like his father. He was persistent, determined, and cunning. Ron was prepared to do whatever he could to achieve his own goals. Ron's father was very stubborn and could do anything for his son to make him happy. He didn't want to watch his son suffer. Dad tried to console his son, gave him many opportunities, acquainted him with the beautiful daughters of his partners, and helped financially. But all this was unsuccessful. There was only one thing in Ron's mind: Allison. Ron's family was trying to support poor Allison. The accident left a significant mark on her life. She lost hope for a promising and bright future. She was grateful to Ron's family for their care and help. She realized that she had no one closer to this family. Out of desperation, the girl agreed to accept Ron's hand and heart and continue the business with him as her late father would have wished. The girl did not feel happy. She was lost. She lived only by work and the idea that she had to continue to work for those she loved. There was no other way out. Ron and his family cared for Allison. Despite their concern, she felt alone and distant. She was like a bird in a cage she'd driven herself into with hopelessness. She never left her thoughts of her parents. She couldn't believe it had happened. Time was passing and grief remained in her heart. Those she loved were killed. The police closed the case quickly, citing heavy rain on the day of the accident. The press soon fell silent. Although the family was famous in the city, there were many moments she did not understand. She didn't figure out what happened because the accident couldn't have been an accident. Allison took all her grief on canvas. She was distracted from the world only when she was drawing. She was drawing a lot. Her paintings were all gloomy, as was her life. She shut herself down. With Ron, they lived as neighbors, even though the guy was hoping that Allison would one day respond with feelings for him. That never happened. Ron was comfortable with the love being there for him. A year passed. The firm was thriving thanks to its young heirs. One day, Ron came to his father's office and found a strange envelope on his desk. His curiosity played its role. It had all the secret data hidden from tax agents and their gray bookkeeping. He knew it could bankrupt the company. The note said, "Go to the police and admit what you did." Ron immediately went to the office to look for his father. He pulled him from the meeting and asked him for an explanation. "What the hell is this, Dad?" Ron asked. "Let me explain it at home to you tonight," Father answered. "No, I want to know right now," Ron said rudely. "Well, I've been getting these threats lately. I don't know who they are and what they want from me." "Dad, but it says to confess. What do you need to confess?" "I don't know," Ron's father answered. Ron turned and went back to his office. He had long been tormented by thoughts of what was happening. He was trying to understand what his father could be hiding. Ron called his assistant Jack and asked him to provide him with all the company documents for the past 5 years. He checked profits and losses until late at night, suspended licenses and contracts. When Ron came home, Allison was fast asleep. He kissed her and lay down beside her. Ron could not sleep. He wanted to find out what was going on behind his back. How could his dad do something like that? Ron entered his father's office more often, looking for clues. One day, he returned to his father's, and he was not there. There was a new envelope on the table. He opened it impatiently. "You rigged the accident," it was written in a note. Ron turned pale and dropped the envelope with the message. He immediately knew what kind of accident it was talking about. The young man could not believe his father could do such a thing. He was angry and confused at the same time. How could you so cruelly get rid of your friends and business partners? What was the need to do this? He had to hide the note. Ron wanted to expose his father. He started asking tricky questions about the day, October 25th. He asked his dad where he was and who he was with. He was doing his research. He didn't want his father to go to prison, but he wasn't going to let him get away with it either. After a while, Ron received a note addressed to him. It said, "You don't know your father well." Ron had suddenly lost all sense of what was going on. What was his father hiding from him? Or someone brazenly lied all this time through the letters and tried to drive his father crazy. Perhaps it was the tricks of business competitors. Then, where did the black books come from? Ron didn't want the family scandal at all. The press spread information quickly, especially if it was scandalous. Ron began to sort out his father's affairs. He stopped paying attention to his wife's business and thought less about his work. He was like a detective trying to dig up the secrets of his father. His connections helped him to find information that his father had another son with a woman. His father never mentioned his son. Ron decided to ask his mother, She was surprised and had to tell about his father's mistress and illegitimate child. "It was a long time ago. You were still young. I found a letter with a photo of the baby. Your father denied that it was his child. That's all I knew." Ron was beside himself with anger. He could not even imagine that he had lived so many years in his father's lies. When his father came home, Ron threw all the notes on the table in front of him and asked for an explanation. His father was surprised and could not say anything. "Why did you keep all this from me? Brother? Accident? Company scams?" Ron asked monotonously. "I wanted a happy family. That woman was a mistake. I didn't want to leave your mother and you. You knew about the accident. It was the only way you could get Allison." Her father was too stubborn and insistent. He did not agree to many things that would bring us profit. Yes, it was a fraud, but the business wouldn't have worked otherwise. I did everything for you. Ron turned and walked away, slamming the door. The next day, Ron waited for Allison for a long time. No one had seen her that day. It was October 25th, 2 years after the accident. About noon, Ron heard a stir in the corridor. Looking out, he saw a police squad picking up his father. He turned to Jack to call a lawyer, but he wasn't there either. When he returned to the office to collect his father's belongings, he saw another envelope. "No one escapes punishment. Your brother, Jack." There were all the company's documents about transferring ownership to Jack and Allison. They were copies. Ron realized what an end their family was waiting for, and nothing could be done at the moment. He followed after his father. As it turned out, after graduating and coming to the firm, Allison fell in love with assistant Jack at first sight. Jack was later a blackmailer and secret brother of Ron's. Ron did not notice as he was investigating his father's lies. Jack eventually came forward and made the argument that Allison's parents had been murdered. He took a job at his father's and brother to avenge his mother. It was easy to find Ron's family. The family were often reported in newspapers and the press. He's been following the family's business for a long time, learning about work moments and looking for weak spots to push on. Jack had access to all the documents and was well aware of the firm's business. He waited for the right moment to destroy everything they had. He couldn't forgive a father for not acknowledging his second child. His father left his woman alone with the baby without money or help. Jack and Allison had good reasons for revenge. Everyone wanted this family to pay the price for their actions. Although Ron was not guilty of anything, he too was cunning and complex as it seemed. Ron was very much like his father. When he heard of his father's affairs, Ron did not report him to the police, which proved his nature. He could have also gone to prison for accounting as an executive director. But Jack and Allison didn't frame Ron. They put his father in charge of everything. Ron's father faced life in prison on 2 counts, a premeditated murder of several individuals and high-profile fraud. So much evidence was presented in court that the case could not be closed this time so easily with the help of his father's attorneys. Jack and Allison were able to right their wrongs and avenge their loved ones. They transferred the ownership and started the firm without fraud. Jack owned the company under the same rights as Ron. Although he was an illegitimate child, he had proof of paternity. Jack was in charge of management, overseeing company affairs. Allison became the chief architect of the holding. Her dream came true. She was doing her favorite thing. Allison donated some of her company's income to orphanages. One day, she had an idea. She wanted to auction the paintings she had painted after her parents' accident and donate all the funds to the orphanage. The auction was a tribute to her beloved father and mother. Jack was happy to support Allison and help with the organization. Soon, Allison's marriage to Ron was dissolved unilaterally, and she was able to marry Jack. Finally, Allison felt happy and loved. Her cell broke down in an instant, and she was able to take off. She was deeply in love with Jack. They had beautiful children. They looked like Allison's parents. Their lives were full of meaning. She became friends with Jack's mother immediately. She was a sweet, modest woman, much like her mother. Allison began to call her mother. Grandma spent time with the kids while the parents worked. They had a pleased and sincere family. Allison wasn't alone anymore. Ron's father had been imprisoned. Ron had taken his mother and left the country. They knew there would be no more meaningful life in this city in the past. They were never heard from again. Father was justly punished for his actions. It was a pity that he realized everything when it was already very late. After 20 years, his father got out early, but had nowhere to go. Everything he cared about disappeared because of one act. He later hung himself in his apartment. His son and wife did not come to his funeral. Maybe they didn't even know about the end of the man who once ruined their lives. Allison and Jack learned of the death from the newspapers. They visited the cemetery once a year. They visited Allison's parents. The bright-eyed little girl ran along the shore. Her mother died in childbirth, and her father was responsible for her upbringing. The tall, lean man was hard on the girl. They lived in the old den. The wooden hut somehow held the heat from each crack that blew cold sea air. The man worked as a guard on the lighthouse. His task was to turn on the lantern for lost ships. She saved people's lives from the seamouth. The girl grew up on her own. Mary did not keep her company telling her stories. She was like a wild reed craving companionship. Her father restricted her from civilization. There was nothing in the house but a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed. Once a week, Mike, her father's name, went shopping. Their diet consisted of black bread, macaroni, and some croup. They were supplied with fish by the sea. These days, the baby was left on the island all alone. "Oh, that's beautiful." She opened the electric board, said the little rascal. Dad was gone. He was late. Mary thought Dad was lost at sea and maybe he needed help. "For Dad to find me, I need to turn on the lantern on the lighthouse. He will see and will come home." Thin baby hands reached into thick electrical wires. She was saving her dad. Before she could get the cable, there was a bang, and many tiny sparks shone across her face. "Ow, it hurts so much." Trying to cover her face with her hands, she fell on the cold, damp ground. A couple of hours later, her father moored to the shore. He didn't see the blonde girl running. He suspected something was wrong. The father's heart was popping out of his chest. Out of breath, the father's heart was popping out of his chest. Out of breath, he ran to the house, but no one was there. After looking through all the daughter's favorite places, he did not find her. There was only one place, the lighthouse. The lighthouse door was open. "Dad, where are you?" Mary's voice was barely heard. "Mary, my daughter, what happened?" The lighthouse keeper shouted. The little girl was lying there with no sign of life. Massive tears were coming out of her eyes. Her father raised his daughter with shaking hands. His daughter had an accident. Mike dragged her outside. "Dad, why is it so dark?" Father looked at his only daughter with horror. The light was shining in the yard. His lips trembled. "So now is the night." The desperate father answered, choking in his tears. She went blind. All life was divided, before and after. Now she had to learn to live in a new way. It had to be a clean slate. He wondered how to explain to poor Mary that she would never see sunlight. How did the seasons change? The 7-year-old girl continued to lie in the man's hands. The father fell to his knees. Pressing his daughter, he wept with all his might. "God, why are you punishing me like this?" He turned to the sky. "You took my wife, and now you want to deprive my daughter of me?" Poor Mike. With the last strength in his fist, he carried his daughter into the house. "Honey, now we have to learn to live in a new way." Tears continued to flow from Mary's eyes. Then she understood the situation. Her childhood world was immersed in eternal darkness. Lying there for a couple of days, she tried to get up. Her white feet stood on a cold wooden floor. She fell a couple of steps. Fear, mistrust, and confusion stopped her. It was a cold, harsh winter. The girl was growing up. Her father tried to breathe life into Mary, but she felt nothing. Her eyes were always cold. She tried to see something, closed her eye, and she squinted all the time, but the result was not there. Having reached the age of 18, the father decided to put his daughter in a specialized boarding school. There were children with various defects, as their parents called them. Mary cried and did not want to let go of her father. After all, she had no mother. She was afraid of losing the one person she knew. The teachers at school were strict. The children were very violent. These children never saw the faces of their natural parents. Their parents had long since abandoned them. They had written them out of their lives. They had not loved Mary since the first day. She was too bright. She was always fighting for justice, defending her point of view. She was trying to survive in a violent environment. Her only consolation was her friend Emma. The girls quickly hit it off. Emma saw but could not hear. She was her eyes. The girls spent all their time together. Emma talked about everything around them, and Mary painted in her imagination the bright world in which she lived. It did not last long. Emma was soon adopted. Mary felt abandoned and forgotten. Mike visited his daughter very rarely. He tried to find a good job and ran to the doctors hoping that at least someone could help him regain his daughter's sight. Everyone had their hands up and refused him. She spent 10 years in this horrible place. Mike took her home after graduating. The lighthouse has been recognized as a local attraction for all these years of absence. Crowds of tourists began to visit the island. But even this did not save the financial situation of the family. It is worth noting that she acquired a unique ability with the loss of vision. She sang very beautifully. She sang songs every time she walked in the open air. She remembered and knew every hillock. Twisting her memories from childhood, she was afraid to forget the brightest moments. As she walked, she hummed her new song. Her eyes were full of tears. She constantly cried as she sang. On that day, another group of visitors arrived on the island. The guide Lively kept the historical story about the old lighthouse. Tourists listened to him very carefully. Among them were two guys. These were young sailors who had just returned from a long voyage. JC, the blonde-haired guy, was different from his friend. JC's friend was too frivolous. At that moment, she was sitting on the hill. The wind was playing in her long, thick hair. Her gaze was drawn further away, trying to see something. JC fell in love with Mary at first sight. He didn't know the girl was blind. He snuck up and tried to capture her on his camera. Hearing the camera click, the girl hurried away. She was avoiding people. But the persistent young man found the right words to win the young lady over to him. Looking into her eyes, he saw the emptiness and despair. Mary looked at his face with her hands. Her long fingers glided over his face. She tried not to miss the features of his face. As she spent her evenings talking, she fell in love with a boy. No one cared or cared more about her than would live without him. His health deteriorated. He had terminal cancer. A terrible cough with blood kept torturing him. Frequent fainting spells prevented his daughter from having a happy life. He left his little girl in the hands of a violent world. Learning that Mary could regain her sight with expensive surgery, JC went to his beloved father. Her father listened to him and said he could not collect such money, and there was no one to lend. He did not have such an amount. JC wanted Mary to start seeing him. JC's crime was the only way to get Mary's sight back. He committed the robbery and secretly sent all the money to the clinic where the surgery was due. That evening was the last time Mary heard the voice of her loved one. JC was forced to resort to deception. He told her that he needed to go on a long sail. The girl's heart trembled. Everyone she loved so much refused her, but she knew he wouldn't be happy with a blind woman. After the act, the boy surrendered to the local police and was given 5 years in prison as punishment. Mary underwent an operation, after which she regained her sight. Meanwhile, the girl learned that she was pregnant. She would have a son. Her father soon died. Now she was alone in this vast world. She gave birth to a son and did not stop waiting for her lover. All day she walked, looking into the faces. She was looking for him, her boyfriend. It was hard to imagine him. She never saw him, only felt his body. She named her son Robert. She came to live on the island alone with her child. It was difficult for her to feed the child at the same time and provide for her financially. In such a limbo, she could not take care of the child. Robert was restless, constantly crying. There was no help. One day, having gathered her son, Mary went to the nearest grocery store. Leaving her son on the street, she tried to leave in a hurry, but the loud cry of her child stopped her. God, what am I doing? She went back to her son. With the child, she wandered the dark streets all night. There was a real war inside her head. She understood that the child was from her lover, which was the fruit of their true love. It was tough for her to live on. She ran out of money. One day, she decided to take her own life. She stepped up the highway with trembling hands and tears in her eyes, suffocating with tears. The sparkle of the headlights blinded her. One car braked sharply in front of her. The driver got out of the vehicle and began shouting at her. She stood, petrified, her son bursting with tears. The man grabbed her and the child and put them in the car and drove them home. He was shocked to see the state of their home and poverty they were living in. He understood what the girl was running from. He understood why she wanted to kill herself and her child. I'm so tired of living. These problems are constantly weighing on my shoulders. She talked and cried at the same time. Sam, the name of her savior, promised to help her. It was painful for him to watch as a young mother struggled to survive in this vast world. The difficulty was that she had never met her lover. In her memories, there was only a voice and image that she imagined for herself. Maybe there was no such person. The man understood the longer he stayed with her, the more he liked her. Mary was ready to take the courtship of a new guy. But one day, she saw her picture in Sam's folder. It was her very first picture. It was me. She froze. Under a pile of papers, she found a guy who was accused of stealing. After learning about the boy's prison, she hurried to see him. She wanted the truth. She did not expect to see her lover as she walked along a dark, damp-soaked corridor. An iron door opened, and she entered the meeting room. She had to wait a few minutes and felt like her whole life was flashing before her eyes. The door opened, but she hesitated to turn. A man's trembling voice called out to her, "Mary!" Hearing his voice, she fell unconscious. She came to her senses and said, "It's that voice. It's him. I found you." After talking to JC, she returned home. Sam sat there as if nothing was happening. Then she realized that Sam was deliberately hiding all the information. He decided to take JC's place, but Mary continued to be calm. Her lover had 6 months to wait before he went to prison. Then they could start over and raise the boy. Sam tried his best to extend JC's sentence, and his goal was to get rid of JC forever, but fate told him otherwise. Mary miraculously learned of Sam's treacherous plan. He tried to deceptively marry the girl, to take away the hut that was in the lighthouse. 3 months had passed. JC was out of prison. During that time, Mary lived in a hut near the lighthouse. Another sleepless night passed. One morning, her son woke up and ran to pick up the seashells after the storm. "Mom," said the child's voice. The woman shuddered. Sam stood on the shore and looked at them with a smile. Mary screamed and ran to kiss her lover. Within a week, they found the right words and explained to Robert that they now had a fully fledged family. "Was your dad?" She said nothing with tears in her eyes. But there was one unfinished business. It was Sam. Mary told about the schemes of the cunning man. JC decided to seek help from the relevant authorities. When he arrived there, he met a friend with whom he went on the same excursion where he saw Mary and lost his mind a few years ago. His friend listened to his story. He promised to help. Soon Sam's frauds were exposed, and the man was imprisoned. The happy family decided to sell all the property and leave the island. With the money they received, they bought a house where they raised their children in perfect harmony. In the group, no one but Emma's girlfriend spoke to her. You can say they used her for their purposes. None of her classmates respected her. His name was Jason. He was a bully. The girl rejected his attempts to talk to her because a rich guy would never love such a gray mouse. And it was true. He had an adult interest in her. Fearing it, she constantly avoided contact. But it was hard because they were in the same class. He had no other choice but to track down Barbara's apartment. He started guarding her at the entrance. "I thought I'd drop you off at school." The girl was upset when she saw her classmates in the yard of her house. To escape from Jason, she was ready to be late for the lecture. After all, he did not miss a skirt. The girl did not want to mess with him. Barbara, the granddaughter of Professor William Johnson, did not want to embarrass her grandfather, who did not give her any privileges, although he taught her. How did he know my address? She was outraged by his behavior, but Jason continued to argue that he cared about her and had the most sincere and warm feelings for her. "Listen to me, Jason. I know you haven't missed a skirt in our department, or maybe you just collected them, but that's none of my business." Her eyes were filled with fear and rage by saying these words. Poor Barbara, if only she knew what she was going through. At this time, the professor continued to lecture in a quiet, monotonous tone. His attention was drawn to the fact that half of the lecture was absent. There was no Barbara. A knock on the door interrupted the teacher. "Sorry, I'm late." The old man's stern voice. "Why?" The girl was scared because it had never happened to her before. She always followed strict instructions, and her grandfather sat in front of her. "I overslept," said Barbara timidly. "Next time, set the alarm, and you get 2 additional questions on the paper as a punishment." The class laughed. The quiet one came. The boys immediately began to make silly jokes. They didn't stop even though she was the most beautiful girl in the class. She had the only friend in the department, Emma, who always came to her rescue. Everyone else did not like her because she was the granddaughter of the most famous professor. Her father and mother died years ago. She was a total orphan. Her upbringing was her grandfather. She barely had enough money to exist, so she dressed constantly in dark shades. The blue-eyed girl with blonde hair could not stand up for herself and continuously avoided noisy company. When she got to the task, she heard a voice. "You're not even going to say hello?" Looking back, she saw Jason sitting behind her back. Without answering anything, she went on with her assignments. The standings were difficult because her future depended on them. Emma and Barbara decided to fortify themselves at lunchtime as usual. The whole class was sitting in the dining room. a long-legged blonde approached their table and asked a strange question. "Are we still on for today? You'll be home by 8 o'clock." So Barbara decided to make some money. The girl used her knowledge differently. She helped underperforming students for an extra fee. They needed homework, and she lacked money. It was all fair. Jason decided to take advantage of this and, conspiring with a friend of Barbara's, was awaiting for her in the apartment. The tall blonde went off to the pharmacy, leaving Barbara alone with him, and Jason locked the door from inside. It ended very badly for the girl, because Jason never tolerated rejection. He attacked her and took her by force. After the incident, the girl's world collapsed into a rattle. She was afraid there would be rumors at the university. The case will be loud and will not be punished anyways. She promised herself she wouldn't say anything to anyone. Barbara did not report him to the police, as the father of the rapist was a mighty man. There was no point in fighting him. With ragged mascara on her face and pain in her heart, she strode through the dark streets, avoiding people and car headlights. In addition, that evening, Grandpa was taken to hospital with another heart attack. The doctor said he'd been rescued at the ICU, but any stress could kill him. A green-eyed Mary in a white robe suspected that something terrible had happened. She offered help, but crying, Barbara refused. At home, she tried to forget all the horror that had befallen her. The rivers of tears ran down her cheeks, but even they could not wash away the shame. For a month, the girl did not leave the house. She constantly put on a hood on the street and was hidden from the eyes. Her grandfather was discharged home. At the next tea party, the older man's attention was drawn to the fact that his vast appetite ate chocolate cake. "Barbara, when did you have time to love chocolate cakes?" "I don't know," she answered. Because in our family, only your mother loved it when she was pregnant with you." "Well, I'm my mother's daughter," Barbara grinned, but her thoughts said otherwise. She drove them away all night. The following day, she couldn't stay at home. Grandpa was discharged from the hospital. Now he was at home, so he would immediately suspect an accident and molest with questions. After a whole month of missed lectures, Barbara decided to study. She was so hoping for the support of her friend Emma. She wanted to tell her how it was going, but something was in the way of stopping. She thought it was not the time yet. She walked into the classroom and saw Jason in the company of that girl's. Her eyes filled with tears of shame. She hated him, blamed herself. "It was my fault," she kept telling herself, with her face gleeful and a finger pointed at her. Jason continued to tear her heart to pieces. Despite this, she continued to walk and keep her head up high as possible. Unable to withstand the pain, she fell unconscious right before him. A month later, it turned out that Barbara was pregnant. She tried to have an abortion, but the doctors did not advise her to do so because of her rhesus factor. In the future, there might be a possibility of not having children. Barbara, desperate, did not know what to do. Professor William heard about the incident from a close friend of Emma's and immediately convinced her granddaughter not to do anything stupid. He didn't care about the details, and he was glad Barbara was having a baby. When the girl's mother died in childbirth, it was because of the consequences of a failed abortion that her father forced upon her at a young age. After Eva's birth, her grandparents and Emma helped Barbara, who took care of her daughter unwillingly. She couldn't stop thinking about the circumstances under which her daughter had been conceived. She felt she was failing as a mother. One day, Jason found out that Barbara had given birth, began to intimidate them. He didn't want people to know he was the child's father. William had become witness to the scene, and his heart had broken. He had passed away. Barbara was left all alone with her child. She struggled through grief and realized she could not cope with a daughter who cried endlessly. Then, she left the stroller with Eva near the children's clinic. Along with the child, she put a note there, asking her to take care of the baby, and indicated her name. It was 7 long years after the tragedy. Barbara worked as a secretary at the bureau and was married to Simon. The man was hurrying with a wedding, but Barbara constantly stalled the process. The man felt that a concrete wall had grown between them. The bride was closing more and more against him every day. The concrete wall was her past, which the young man knew nothing. Simon didn't think she was sneaking around to watch her daughter grow up. She kept an eye on her life and gave her birthday gifts through her best friend. Emma worked at a charity foundation, so it was easy for her to see Barbara's daughter. Eva's fate was miraculous. She was adopted by the head of the Children's Fund, John and Mary Snow. Barbara understood the complexity of the situation. She couldn't just take her daughter away from her a few years ago. To do this, she had to take the baby by force. In order to not cause stress to the child, she had to find a way out. The woman decided to go rogue and play child psychologist and many nanny roles simultaneously. So she came into the family and started living with her little girl under the same roof, presenting herself as a child specialist. It seemed all the troubles were over, but Jason came out of nowhere. The guy came to John's house. He said he was the daughter's birth father and asked for a substantial amount of money to get rid of their biological mother. Mary Snow realized this was the only chance to get rid of Eva's biological mother once and for all. Jason conspired with Mary Snow to get rid of Barbara for a decent sum. One day in an argument, John Snow decided to kick his wife out of the house. As a result of the quarrel, Eva learned that she was their adopted daughter. In tears, she ran to her room. A desperate father threw everything into letting the young lady know he loved her madly. Mary could not understand why her husband had allowed Barbara into the house and treated her so well because she was a servant. There was no end to her jealousy. She feared Barbara would take away her husband. One night, a message arrived on Barbara's phone with an address. She drove there without slowing down. The door was left open, and when she came in, she saw Jason lying in a pool of blood, the knife handle sticking out of his chest. Frightened, she called the police. As the only witness, she was detained until the circumstances were clarified. The interrogation revealed that the prints on the knife were left behind when Jason tried to pull out the knife. Barbara wouldn't let him do it because he could have bled out and died before the doctors arrived. Even though he was cruel to her, she fought for his life to death. A small silver earring was shown to Barbara in the hopes that she was the owner of this Tamming. The girl couldn't remember when she saw the object. Sometime later, she called John, claiming that this jewel she saw on his wife Mary, and asked for his help. John remembered that this evening his wife was away somewhere. When she came home, she was confused and pale as snow. She went straight to the bathroom, where she spent quite a while. By juxtaposing all these facts, John began to rummage through her things in the hopes of finding a second earring. But the woman took care of it and got rid of the evidence. Out of desperation, John rushed to review his wife's photos on social media and found evidence implicating his wife. It was a deer horn earring. John persuaded his wife to confess to him during a quarrel to extract a confession of murder and clear the name of an innocent girl. At that time, the audio recording was turned on. It turned out that Mary was once again jealous of her husband, and she had planned things with Jason. He agreed. After all, the proposed amount clouded his mind, but the greedy lad couldn't resist the charming Mary during their secret meeting and plotted the same illegal acts, trying to rape her the same way. The woman broke free and grabbed the first thing she could. It was a knife. Then she sent a message to Barbara's phone, so she decided to get rid of her adopted daughter's mother and her rival. Poor Barbara, unaware of the plot between the two, rushed to the crime scene. The next day, John handed the recording to the investigator. Mary was locked up in prison. Barbara and John returned to Eva. Now their daughter's well-being was in their hands. No one stood in their way. "Hello, little girl. I know that it will not be so easy for you to forgive me." With these words, she turned to her 8-year-old daughter. Her tears seemed to choke her. She got out an album with pictures of all 7 years. With her shaking hands, she opened it. Those pictures captured her most vivid moments from the childhood of the little princess. Eva burst into tears and hung on to her mother's neck. Barbara, Eva, and John became a real family.
A ray of sunshine broke through a small gap between the gray curtains and blinded Mary. She hadn't slept in a long time because her stepfather came home late from work, and, as usual, he lectured his mother for a long time. Mary never understood why her mother chose to marry this ugly and intrusive man, and she had 4 children with him, her younger sisters and brothers. Her mother was a kind and gentle woman, but very soft, and she could not resist her husband. All Mary knew about her father was that he was the first love of a very young Jessica and left the day she found out Jessica was pregnant. Mary didn't want to get up because she didn't sleep and had to work all day. After graduating high school, her stepfather put her in the store as an assistant. Mary liked to study, but Harry Thompson did not want to pay for her further education. The girl dreamed of becoming a designer. She painted well that even school teachers often sent her work to competitions. On the shelf among the school notebooks and books, Mary had letters of thanks that she was very proud of. Her mother quietly went into her daughter's room and practically gestured that she needed to get up. Mary dressed, cleaned herself up, and caught a glimpse of her weariness and lack of sleep. Avoiding her stepfather, she burrowed into the kitchen, swallowed a sandwich, said goodbye to her mother, and left the apartment. The street was sunny and quite warm, despite September. The shop in which she worked was a 30-minute walk away. Mary took her time because she had a decent time. She strolled, thinking about everything, when suddenly she remembered that she had left her phone at home. She didn't want to come back, but she needed the phone too because, in between jobs, she managed to listen to a free intensive course for aspiring designers. Yet, deep down, Mary never gave up her dream of becoming a designer, so she decided to come back. The girl walked back so quickly that she ran into a young man who had just muttered in response to Mary's apology. Out of breath, she called the apartment, whose door could not open for a long time. Her stepfather was already asleep. Her mother was gathering the children for school. Mary grabbed the phone and ran to work. Mr. Alford, the clothing and shoe store owner, took a hard look at the late Mary, but said nothing. The girl slipped into the staff room and quickly changed her clothes. Her task was to keep the store clean and help the sellers. The store was on a busy street, so there were many visitors, and Mary ran between the clothing and shoe counters from morning to evening. So she came across one of her clients and thought she'd seen this man somewhere before. It was a young guy from the street who she ran into in a hurry and who seemed to recognize her too. He smiled and said, "Hey, can you stop knocking me down?" Mary was very embarrassed and blushed, but she didn't say anything. It must be noted that she was always embarrassed when young people paid attention to her, although she was beautiful. Blue eyes, white skin, and a proper nose gave her face a nice look. But she didn't even dare look at the young man and went to the other side of the hall. What a surprise it was when, after work, she saw that guy again at the door. Now he was embarrassed and barely heard him say, "I'm sorry, but can I walk you home?" Mary was embarrassed again and said nothing, heading towards the house. The young man followed her. "Don't think about it. I have no evil thoughts. I just liked you very much. I was afraid you would leave, so I waited for you. My name is Ryan. What's your name again?" Mary knew it was wrong to meet on the street, but she gave her name without knowing why. That was the beginning of their acquaintance. Ryan was now waiting for Mary the evening after work, and they went for a walk through the darkening streets. Mary learned that Ryan worked for a management company and that he was the only son in the family. The young people soon became mutually sympathetic. For Mary, their meetings were an outlet where she could take her mind off family matters. She was already dreaming of leaving her home, where there was little room for her because of her stepfather. They could talk about anything with Ryan, and they seemed to understand each other with half a word. And then the day came when Ryan met Mary and invited her to a cafe near the store. As soon as they sat down at the table, he made a small order and looked at Mary very significantly as soon as the waiter left. The girl was surprised, but did not say anything. "Dear Mary, you and I have known each other for 3 months. That's not enough to get to know each other. I love you." Mary blushed. Tears came out, and through them she whispered, "Me too." 2 months later, Mary and Ryan were married. The wedding was modest in the same cafe where the proposal was made. Only the closest and most few friends came. The young people first rented an apartment, but after a while, they took out a loan and bought a small, cozy apartment on a quiet street. Mary couldn't believe her happiness. At last, she is her mistress, without a grumpy and rude stepfather who counts every penny and never lets go of anything to reproach Mary and her mother. Mary had furnished her family's nest, although at first they lived very modestly, but the apartment was always clean, cozy, and smelled delicious. A year later, their son Mark was born, which Mary doted on. Amid her maternal feelings, Mary seems to have missed something in her relationship with her husband. Ryan was coming home more and more late than usual. He stayed with friends and went out on Sunday night with his buddies. At first, Mary did not pay much attention to this, explaining it to her husband's fatigue and workload. But one day, Ryan returned and confessed that he'd been fired from his job. From that moment on, a dark chapter in their life together began. Ryan refused to look for a new job, believing that he had been unfairly fired, and feeling sorry for himself for a long time. Mary was very supportive of him, but soon realized that the reason was that he didn't want to work. 2 months later, he just got used to living like this, and Mary was woefully short of money to support herself and her son. The funds provided by the state was not enough, and she stopped expecting support from her husband. 6 months had passed. Mary was relatively low, and then she decided to find a job. She left that job when her son was born, and finding a new one wasn't easy because she didn't have an education. She also had to leave the baby with someone. Ryan was afraid to keep the baby. Her mother was living with 4 children, and Ryan's parents, it turned out, were not keen on participating in the lives of their son and grandson. And yet, Mary got her mother to sit with Mark for a couple of hours while her stepdad was at work. And she was running around the organizations and offices asking that she be taken at least a cleaner. But they did not want to take this position. And, having completely despaired, she crossed the threshold only to open Hotel Monroe. She was met in the hall by a female administrator who told her that they only wanted cleanup girls who were responsible and decent. Mary agreed and was sent to the manager, who turned out to be a lovely young man. He listened attentively to Mary and, for some reason, felt a great deal of sympathy for her and decided that it would be okay if she were accepted as a maid. Mary seemed to him to be a friendly and tidy girl. Happy and satisfied, Mary was walking home. For some reason, she felt a new life was beginning for her. Ryan wasn't home. His mother said he'd gone away in a car, and she packed up and rushed home. Mary put her son to bed and went to sleep herself. In the middle of the night, she heard a noise and voices outside the door. Mary opened the door and saw her husband's friends, Tom and Brian. "Mary, don't worry, it's not that bad." This made Mary nervous and dizzy. Ryan was in a car accident. He hit a man on the street. Now he's at the police station. "Dead?" Mary whispered with her white lips. What? Tom didn't get it. Hit him to death? Asked Mary, afraid to hear the answer. No, but a man with a concussion, broken arm and leg. Mary breathed a sigh of relief, though she felt it was a temporary relief and all the difficulties lay ahead. She asked a neighbor to look after her son and went to the station. Ryan sat with his head down and was interrogated, but was released in the morning. Mary didn't ask him about the details of the accident. According to the coroner, Ryan was responsible for the accident, hit another car, and drove to the side of the road. The man was also walking in the wrong direction, but it didn't diminish Ryan's guilt. What are we going to do? Ryan asked Mary in confusion, as if she were the one who should know the answer. Let us break through, answered his wife, and everything trembled with anxiety inside her. A series of interrogations, calls to the station, and meetings with a lawyer. The victim, the man, did not want to meet with Ryan and his lawyer and asked for possible and unthinkable amounts of physical and moral damage. Even if Mary and Ryan had sold everything, they wouldn't have that kind of money. Money was sorely lacking. Mary borrowed money from everyone who could help her, but it wasn't enough. They were waiting the court's final decision, which would determine how much to pay to the aggrieved man. It was Ryan's day to make amends, almost as good as their apartment. They had to make a decision. No one could help them. Mary was sitting on the couch. Her face was stone. Ryan dared not even look at his wife. After a profound silence, he said, "We need to sell the apartment. Part of the amount will be used to repay the loan, and most of the money will have to be paid to Manson, the victim's name." Mary was silent. She had nothing to say. She knew Ryan had no other choice. At that moment, she hated him for his cowardice, laziness, and infantility. What about Mark and me? Where are we going to live? Have you thought about that? But I have no other options. Otherwise, I will be put in prison. Do you want this? Of course, you would live here at your pleasure, and I sit behind the cage, he cried out. You hit a man. You're to blame, said Mary. Where am I going with my son? We have no savings, only debts. Mary went into the kitchen and cried. She seemed more miserable and miserable than ever. And Mark, her poor child, will wander in search of a home. But very soon Mary came to her senses. She was always strong, and she will not give up now. Okay, sell the apartment. Only I have a condition. I am filing for divorce. I will not live with a man who has traded family for friends and poker. You refused to work when I was running around town begging for a job, and you were driving around the city with your buddies. I feel condemned and my son to poverty. Ryan stared at Mary with disbelief. A month later, they divorced in court. Ryan sold the apartment, paid a fine, and disappeared. Mary was left with her son in her arms on the street. Her mother felt sorry for her and called her home. But as soon as her stepfather saw Mary and Mark at home, he said, You stay here tonight, and tomorrow you'll be gone. I don't need more mouths in this house. All night Mary did not sleep, and in the morning left Mark with her mother and went to work in Monroe. Without looking at anyone, she went to the manager's office and knocked on the door. Yes, come in, said a familiar voice. Mr. Castle, I have a challenging situation. I have no place to live with my son. If you let me and my child stay temporarily in the hotel, I can work overtime. Then I will solve the housing issue. Mr. Castle listened very carefully to Mary, and she cried. She had not called since that episode in the kitchen. She held on as best she could. I'm sorry, it's my nerves. Well, Mrs. Brooke, I'll make sure you have a room. Mary left with confidence. At least for a while, they will have a roof over their head, and there she will get out. The next day, Mary moved into a small room, which was a staff room. There was one big bed, a table, and a wardrobe. Nothing else could fit there, but Mary was pleased about that too. She was helped by sympathetic maids who looked after her son. A month had passed. One day she had a phone call. It was Ryan. He was drunk and demanded to see his son. He promised to sue for a time to see him. Mary's attempts to talk him out of it didn't help. If you don't want to give me your son, then pay me the money, he shouted. Mary knew her son didn't want to see his father, so she said, Okay, I'll only pay you if you disappear from our lives. I promise, said the ex-husband. Mary hung up and wondered where she would get the money to pay off her hateful ex-husband. Mr. Castle, she thought. Mary realized it was risky to use the manager's kindness, but there was no way out. She decided to ask him for money and get away from Ryan forever. At that moment, someone knocked on their room door. "Come in," said Mary, in surprise, and even more surprised to see Mr. Castle at the door. What a coincidence, she thought. "I was passing by and thought I'd see how you were settling in," said the manager calmly. "Thank you. Well, thanks to you," said Mary, embarrassed. "You don't need anything, Mr. Brooke?" No, we have everything." "Why do you look worried?" "Yes, it is echoes of the past. The ex-husband asks for money, so he does not demand to see his son, and I do not want him to have his influence on him." It was in Mary's mind to ask about the money, but she didn't say anything, and the manager probably didn't think it was polite to ask her if she had any money. He glanced at the wall above the bed and saw a collage of superheroes on the wall. Mary was drawing this so that her son wouldn't be so bored. Mary caught his eye. "Mr. Castle, if it's too much, I'll wipe it all down. The paint's off easy." No, it's wonderful." After another minute, the manager said goodbye and left. The next day, after cleaning the rooms, Mary hurried down the hall to her room, when suddenly she was called and told that the manager was waiting for her in the office. Mary was alarmed, thinking it was about the painted wall. She entered the manager's office. Her fears were partially justified, but that's not what Mr. Castle was saying. "Mrs. Brooke, I appreciate your artistic ability and would like to suggest that you do the same with the wall in the children's playroom on the second floor of our hotel. Of course, the payment will be different than the one you received as a maid. Do you agree?" "Mr. Castle, but I have absolutely no artistic training, and I'm not sure—" "Mrs. Brooke, do you agree or not?" "Yes," said Mary. For a whole week, Mary had been testing her art muse, and by the admission of many, everything worked out perfectly. The children's room became lively and colorful thanks to Mary's drawings. Her work was well paid for, and she paid off her husband, who called her almost every day. Having seen Mary's talent, the manager offered her a place as a decorator at the hotel. Mary agreed because it was her dream to become a designer. It was hard to start, but she could do it. She worked even at night. She was learning in parallel. Mark grew up. Mary took him to kindergarten. They left the hotel room when they were better off with the money. Mary rented an apartment near her mother so she could come to her daughter comfortably. Thus, day after day, difficult times and painful memories faded into the past. Now, every day was bright for Mary. Happiness with its warm rays touched her face. Good things were beginning in her life and continued. Soon, she went from Mrs. Brooke to Mrs. Castle, but that's a different story.